Hi, thank you for being here tonight. I'm Hillary Irons, the Gallery and Exhibitions Director at the University of New England Art Galleries. Welcome to tonight's lecture, Homesick, Architects as Essential Healthcare Workers. This talk is presented in conjunction with Sensing Place, curated by Justine Kablack and Anna Queen at the UNE Art Gallery in Portland, Maine through June 12th. The artwork in Sensing Place speaks to the concept of the body's psychic response to specific architectural spaces. In this talk, we'll look at the subject matter from a more empirical perspective. Our speaker tonight is architectural historian Jon Calame. Mr. Calame is an adjunct professor of art history at the Maine College of Art and Design and is the co-author of a 2009 book entitled Divided Cities: Belfast, Beirut, Jerusalem, Mostar, and Nicosia. He will be joined by Dr. Susan Wary, Chief of Geriatrics at UNE's College of Osteopathic Medicine. If you have any comments along the way, you can put them in the chat. And there will also be a question and answer session after the talk as well. But feel free to reach out via the chat. And thank you so much again for being here.
All right, thanks, Hill. I'm Jon Calame, and it's really nice to be here with everybody tonight. I know it's a funny time. There's a lot of other things that are pressing on people's minds and calendars, so it's great to be together with you guys in this kind of virtual environment that has been created for the talk. So I will dive in with not much further ado. The topic is the question of what architects can contribute to a public health conversation, which is something that I think is a fundamental conversation in the realm of architecture, but is not often talked about in normal academic discourse around architecture. So I'm a product of architecture school, graduate school. And so for me, there was never any indication while I was getting my master's degree that there was any linkage between spatial design and medicine at all. But my work in the field has led me in a very different conclusion. And some of my observations, both just intellectually and as a practicing sort of art historian and historic preservationist, are going to be in the slides that I'm going to show you now. So please feel free to put your questions out there through the chat or any other mode that you can reach, and we will answer them as best we can. And I'm happy to answer questions along the way too. So I'm going to go ahead and just jump in and start with my slides. And hopefully the tech will work out for us. So there we go. There should be a slide in front of everyone who's watching with the screen, and I will progress from here. So the title of the talk is Homesick. And the question that came up between Hillary and I way back when, and Susan, when we were talking about this, is in this art gallery where I'm sitting now, there's a show that has to do with art and its relationship to space. And then we were just kind of thinking, what could we add to the kind of atmosphere of ideas here that would be useful? And the part that I'd like to offer you is quite simple. The headline would be that architects could become vital team members with respect to public health provision, the provision of public health services. But that's certainly not how they see themselves. And I'm going to try to talk a little bit about why architects don't see themselves in that light and how that could be changed, and how it would actually be good, very good for a lot of people in terms of their mental and physical health to have that change take place. This would be a fundamental kind of existential shift for architects. And when I say architects, I mean the whole realm of built environment professionals. So urban designers, straight up designers, historic preservationists, and so forth. All the people whose daily work would be shaping the environment that the rest of us live in, those are the people that I'm talking about when I talk about architects here. So that's sort of shorthand. Okay, so that's our theme. And let's dive in. The show that I'm in the midst of right now, by the way, the art exhibit that I'm in the midst of, is looking at space in all kinds of different ways, metaphorically and literally. And I love thinking about space through the lens of art as well. So for example, when I when I think about space in art, I think about artists that I love. Like here's a wonderful untitled piece by Mark Rothko. And to me, Rothko's work is astonishing. It's just astonishing because it seems to create space that I can't quite understand or define, but there it is. It appears to be there for us. And when I get closer, I like to get really up close to a Rothko. And when I get up close and it sort of fills my peripheral vision, it feels like I'm looking at sort of pure light. And light and space, of course, are sort of inseparable, right? At least for people who are using their eyeballs. And so art, of course, has always had this very profound and basic relationship with light. And light is going to be sort of the main actor in our drama as I'm trying to present it to you tonight. And I hope that will become clear very soon. And I don't mean that metaphorically at all. I mean that quite literally. So speaking of Rothko, though, Rothko has a very particular relationship as an artist to architecture itself, an unusually strong one, because in Houston, as part of the Demonil collection, some of you who are in the art world may know, or just Rothko lovers may know, that there's something called the Rothko Chapel. We're looking at it now. It's quite an interesting building. I really can't think of another building like it in the world. There probably are buildings like it, but this is kind of special. It is a building built exclusively for the permanent exhibition of Rothko's pieces, which often are very large. And so if you ever have a chance to go into this beautiful building, which as you can see is part of a sort of formal garden with a reflecting pool and all kinds of amazing elements. If you go inside, you'll find this. It's in 360, but it's a building built not just to look at art. There's plenty of those in the world, obviously, but to look at this particular art forever. And I think this is great. I would have been disappointed if they had built a chapel to some artist whose stuff I didn't really like, but I love Rothko. And one of the things that if you know the work of Rothko, is that it reacts to light in such a complex way. And it seems to me that it sort of almost pulls material out of the person looking at it. It's sort of like a screen. It's almost like a projection screen, but not. It's gorgeous, and it seems to imply sort of psychic space. And in this case, there's actual real space that it's sitting in this very particular way. And I hope you can see from my slide how large these canvases are. So when you get up near them, and in this room where there's only a skylight, so it's all this diffused, beautiful, cool light coming down into this relatively small, relative to the size of museums, room, it's very profound. And so here's a great example of a very literal marriage between, let's say, architecture and art. It's obviously a very unusual artist that would ever have anyone build a building just for their work to be shown permanently. We could also think of Donald Judd's complex in Marfa, Texas, as another example of work that has been permanently installed in dedicated and very elegantly designed buildings. So there's a few examples of this, but it's ridiculously rare, obviously. So while this is a wonderful and very moving example of art and its relationship to architecture, it's what we're going to be talking about today is something quite a bit different, something much more pragmatic and maybe a little bit depressing, because we're talking about the way buildings can make people sick. And they do. And I think we all have a fundamental intuitive understanding of how buildings badly designed can make people sick. It can be as simple as not having good ventilation. So mold and allergens can stay in buildings and make people ill, but it goes well beyond that. So I'd like to share with you, as a sort of telegraphing of my intentions, a few of the points that I'm going to try to make. And I'll confess right now that it's not necessarily in a super coherent order. This is the order it sort of in which it occurred to me. And I hope it makes some sense to you. I hope there's something in this menu of topics and subtopics that you can find useful and interesting in the work that you do, or just as a thinking individual. That's my hope, that I can offer something of interest to each one of you, perhaps. I'm interested in the idea of light casts. That is, people who get to have a lot of light in the buildings that they use, and those who don't get light. And the reason why I think that's a possibly interesting way to think about a kind of a specialized caste system in the world is because light, direct sunlight with UVB rays, is the main way we as human beings generate a hormone, a vitamin called vitamin D3. And it's just a wildly important part of our overall functioning and the functioning of our immune system. And this is something that my colleagues from the medical field who are here tonight knows so much more about than I do. But I know at least that vitamin D3 is really one of the big, basic, important ones. And by the way, speaking of medicine and the colleagues that we have here, especially Dr. Susan Wary, who's here to help with the discussion. It's such a pleasure for me to be able to sort of get out from my normal bandwidth, which is talking about architecture, urban planning, and art history, and cross fences, climb fences, and be here in a conversation with people who have similar interests and concerns with respect to human beings, but get at them through a completely different way. I mean, that's the nature of multidisciplinary conversations, but I'm really grateful for this one. This is one I've been looking forward to for a long time. This is one that I think should happen a lot more often. I hope I can convince you out there that it should happen more often too. And I'm grateful to Hillary for hosting this whole party. Anyway, vitamin D3 is really important. And if you can't get to the sunlight often, then you can't generate the vitamin D3 that happens in your skin enough. And that can make you very sick or make you vulnerable to a host of sicknesses. And I will get much more specific about how that works, because it's an important point for me to make. And I'm hoping to convince you that it's an important one too. So I'm, broadly speaking, looking at a few of what we might call the spatial vectors for public health. And I mean that, right, very literally, how space can negatively or positively influence public health outcomes. And it's actually very easy to talk about this, especially in the negative, I'm afraid. But of course, every negative can be flipped into a positive. And in theory, that's what designers should be doing, right? Designers of anything, of yo-yos or of electric cars or of houses should always be trying to find the next big problem that hasn't been solved and design a better solution to it. So, this should be good. Even if we can mainly talk about the ways in which spatial vectors are resulting in bad health or in disease, that should be great, because good designers love a good challenge, I hope. Another point that I'd like to make this evening, if I can, is the history of how architecture sees itself as a profession. And I will just say right now that the way architecture in our Western tradition, I can't speak to the others, but the way architects typically get trained in the United States and in Europe is with what I'm going to call an optic conscience, which is a kind of a convoluted way of saying they think about what their buildings look like and if they look good. And you can win a lot of applause and awards and contracts if your buildings look good. But of course, as soon as I say that, I think we can all immediately sense how absurd that is, because it doesn't really matter how a building looks for the most part. It matters a little bit maybe, but what really matters is how it works once you're inside it, sleeping, making dinner, working, because that's what we do, right? We use buildings. We do walk by them and we do see them and we could admire them, but that's not really the main thing. The main thing is who's inside and how does it feel to be in there. So architecture has grown up, has evolved in the West with an optic conscience. And I'll try to explain what I mean by that more directly in a minute. But what I think it should be replaced by, I think that optic conscience has created a lot of waste and a lot of lost opportunities. And it's kind of boring. It's a beauty contest. What we should be doing in architecture, in my opinion, is understanding ourselves in terms of the functional potential of what we make. I wouldn't say that to a sculptor or a painter, because we don't think about the function of a sculpture or a painting that way. And thank goodness there's lots of things in the world that don't have to be assessed in terms of their functional potential. But architecture, for the most part, is about functional potential. And when the function of a structure fails, it can fail catastrophically. And I don't mean necessarily falling in on your head, although that does happen, right? We find that corrupted designers and contractors don't build buildings in seismic zones properly according to code, and people do die actually from the building falling in on them. But the falling in that I'm thinking about now is the way a building can fail, not so much structurally, but functionally, in terms of the things you need for good mental and physical health. That's the point that I'm going to try to be dwelling on this evening. And that's where I think architecture should be focused and anchored as a profession. And it's a long way from that if you look at how architects get trained today. I'm also going to talk a little bit about transcriptive conservation, which would be an examination of how hallowed and respected buildings from the past can help us with new construction, can inform new construction. And I'll be using a genetic metaphor to do that. And mainly, I'll try to land on this issue of the collaborative potential that lies in front of us. And when I say collaborative, I just mean a collaboration between actual public health professionals and physicians and the medical field in general, and the field of built environment professionals. Those two groups should be totally intertwined at this point. They should be talking, thinking, doing research together, figuring stuff out, sharing, pooling data, all of that stuff. And I think it's fair to say that that almost never happens. And I find that very strange and problematic. And I would be curious to know what some of you think, or perhaps you know about instances of this kind of collaboration that I don't, which I would be very curious to understand. So I will land, if possible, in 20 or 30 minutes on that point of the collaborative prospects and potential. And that's where hopefully we will enter into a conversation with you and other colleagues that are here to think about how that could actually work. So I'll give you a few thoughts along the way about how I think it could work. Okay, so let me back up. I made a kind of a strong and slightly cynical assertion a couple seconds ago about how architects have evolved to just think about how their buildings look. And I wish I was wronger about this than I think I actually am. I mean, it's a terrible generalization, and there's millions of excellent designers out there who really deeply care about how buildings work. So obviously, I'm more talking about the sort of paradigm part of it. I'm talking about how architecture as a field has judged its own products. And I know a little bit about it because I trained in it. I was taught everything you could sort of learn in school and college about architectural history. And I can tell you that while there were occasional moments where we thought about how something functioned, for the most part, 97% of the time, the conversation was about how a building looked. Now, the looking might be rather deep. It might include a thorough examination of the bones and the structure and the inside and the outside and plan section elevation. But whether it's totally superficial, like the image that I have on the screen now, or whether we're looking like sort of more technically at, the guts and the details, it still typically is very much about sort of style, the sort of psychic value of certain spaces. And that is relevant, right, to psychology and everything. But for the most part, let's just say we're looking at pictures of architecture, which is crazy because as good as a building may or may not look, again, what really matters is how is it going in there? How are people feeling? So I didn't totally cherry pick these covers. These are just go to any magazine rack in any airport you like, or any place that has something to do with architecture, and you're going to see images like this, and they're seductive. And these are probably really beautiful buildings, and some of them might be good buildings to live in or work in, but we really wouldn't know from reading these magazines for the most part. And that in essence is sort of my complaint here. I admit, I'm making a complaint. I'm being a curmudgeon, but I think I'm being a curmudgeon for a good reason, because this isn't about just sort of what I like or what you like or my sort of opinion about some direction. This is about people getting sick. Now, it's not the people so much living in these kinds of houses that are getting sick. I'll grant you that. That's the other problem with how architecture sees itself. It's a inherently gentrified sort of profession in terms of its where it gets its self-esteem, how it thinks about itself and its function in the world. So needless to say, buildings are very expensive. And so if you're going to design one or get hired to design one, you need to be working with wealthy people. But the majority of people in this world are not clients and are not wealthy, and they still need a place to sleep and rest and bathe and be born and die and work productively. So these are pictures of how architecture often portrays itself, and especially these are important. These kind of this kind of low-hanging fruit that I've grabbed here with these magazine covers, because it's showing the superstars. These are the ones that won the lottery, right? These are the ones that made it to the cover of some magazine. So this is clearly how architecture is supposed to be, right? These are the winners. But all we're doing is we're looking at handsome images of interiors and exteriors. That guy you might be able to see sitting in his weird, Pentagon-like window, that's pretty sweet, right? Like that person is probably a model, but if they're actually the owner of that house, they paid a pretty penny for that detail. But that looks like a miserable place to sit to me, and it looks uncomfortable, and it doesn't look like it has good ventilation. But man, is that an awesome picture. And this reminds me, this whole approach to this optic conscience, as I'm calling it, of architecture, reminds me of the really twisted movement. I think it was like in the 1920s or something, called phrenology. I'm pretty sure this is called phrenology, where people got crazy with these calipers. They were buying the most amazing calipers, and they were measuring other people, their skulls, their ears, it's kind of like this veiled racism or something. But basically there was this idea that you could tell how good a genetic specimen someone was by measuring their cranium and their nose or something. Anyway, it was twisted. Okay. And I know that this is a crazy example, but in my mind, sitting around in school and looking at pictures of buildings, even famous buildings, is a little bit like what's happening to this guy. And the feeling that I feel when I'm just told to look and memorize images, especially external images of buildings that are experienced from the inside, it makes me feel a little bit like what this guy looks like to me. He's like, what is going on here? What's with the calipers? How is that going to help anything? And so in a way, the images, the glossy, beautiful, seductive, very attractive images of canonical buildings in the history of architecture, I'm making a crude analogy to these calipers and to this idea of this totally irrational business of phrenology. Okay, so what would be better than measuring someone's genetic health or overall fitness with calipers on their nose? It would probably be the normal things that we do, measuring their blood pressure and their temperature and doing a blood test. I would assume that would be the right thing to do. Okay. So here we go. This is an image of Karachi, a mega city in Pakistan. And I'm showing it to you because this is a very, very, very typical example of mostly illegal, out of code housing for people who can't afford the architect who could build them that Pentagon window. And this is how the majority of human beings on Earth live if they're living in and near an urban center. So I admit Pakistan is a bit of an extreme example, but it's also where I first conceived of this set of ideas, because I was visiting an architecture school in Karachi, which is where this photo was from. And it started to really dawn on me that this was a major thing that I had never really spent enough time wondering about. And so this housing is grim, and that's true everywhere you go. And there's nothing that's going to ungrim this architecture anytime soon. But I'm interested in a very particular part of the grimness, which is the dimness, the lack of light, the lack of access to light. Now, I think we all like to have light coming in the window, but I'm talking about vitamin D3 production here too. So when I was mentioning a second ago that there are light caste, CASTE, I mean what we're looking at now. I mean the people who get a little bit of sun that might come in their window for a few hours a day, and those who just live too low or too tucked in to ever get any decent light. And this is, not a completely outrageous example of urban density in non-affluent city environments, where you can just sense right from looking at this picture who is in the upper caste light-wise and who's literally in the lower caste. And it is exactly about altitude, but it's also about orientation and which side your windows are facing and how many windows you have and how much other stuff is blocking those windows, like let's say air conditioners or laundry. So there's a whole lot of variables, but you get the basic point. It's not a complex one. And there's an unlimited number of possible ways that we could depict what it's like to be in a low light caste in this world. And this is just one of many examples. Well, things get narrow, things get dense, things get crowded, and there's a lot of overhang. And that's kind of good on maybe a rainy day, or if it's super hot and you need shade. Admittedly, those are all factors in a place like Karachi as well. But for the most part, we need sunlight to hit our skin directly, not indirectly, in order to get the UVB rays that need to catalyze that process of vitamin D3 production, which again happens automatically, magically, in my view, in our skin, but it needs sunlight. Now, things get a little bit more interesting, in fact, even more complex when we add in gender and social factors. So here's another view from the same part of the world, from Southeast Asia. And here's a space that probably is very typical for dense areas of a city and probably doesn't get very much light, not enough probably to generate the health outcomes that we would want. But it gets, and speaking of that, this is the diagram for how it basically works, just for the nerds in the audience. So light hits your skin, it reacts with an enzyme that you can see here is called 7-dehydrocholesterol. And then that generates this reaction that creates vitamin D3. And vitamin D3 then goes on to do a million really important and essential things for our bodies. So just trust me on that one, because that's just like really a central thing. So that's what we want to go on. That's what we need to go on. Not too much of it. We all know that too much UV light is bad, but we need just enough to produce enough vitamin D3. So what can we say? What can we say about what we learned in the Karachi environment? Like, what does Karachi have to tell us? Karachi being a very hot and sunny place. So you think, what a weird place to talk about a lack of access to light. It's like blisteringly sunny and hot there. That's true. And those with the money can live in the places where they get plenty. That's fine. But here are some of the things that happen in a place like Karachi with respect to light and architectural design that I think are relevant to our conversation. So one thing is we have crowding in high-rise rental spaces, a universal fact of megacities and other cities. We have density that does not allow direct sunlight to penetrate walkways, streets, and parks. Totally intuitive, basic stuff. We've already covered that with those images. But now it's getting a little bit more interesting. There are traditions mandating full body clothing coverage in many social settings, including a lot of Pakistan, and that is specific to women who are following those traditional sort of mandates of body coverage. So of course, that cuts down on how much sunlight is going to hit your skin, and that's going to be a gendered discrepancy. We have hot climate conditions. We have hot temperatures that then encourage people to avoid daytime activities, which is reasonable, but it just is another factor pushing back against exposure to sunlight. And for those who are inherently deprived of direct sunlight, that's an unfortunate collision, right? So it is terribly hot in the summertime and you don't really want to be out there, but it just is one more thing that means you're not getting the UV light that you need to produce vitamin D3. Ambient air pollution levels, which are massively horrible in a place like Karachi and many other megacities, block UVB light. So they just happen to deflect it so it never gets to us. That's the greenhouse effect of, greenhouse global warming. But another bad part of that maybe you haven't thought about, I certainly hadn't until recently, is that we humans don't get some of the UVB light that we need for this project that I've been talking to you about. Okay. Also, skin pigmentation changes the extent to which you need sunlight exposure. So lighter skinned people need less time in the sun to get the same amount of vitamin D3 produced in relation to darker skinned people. And in a country like Pakistan, the skin pigmentation is darker on average. So that's another constraint. And there's also a kind of a cultural push to preserve lighter skin tones. And so that also mitigates against being in the sun. And again, that's often more true. That's more of an imposition on women's psyches than men's psyches in that part of the world, as I understand it. And lastly, on my list, which is not a comprehensive list, there are socio-religious mores that limit public movement for women, or really any movement outside the house for women, especially women who are participating in a very traditional, kind of Islamic, environment and setup. So all of these things mitigate against being in the sun. And that means that your health is at risk with respect to some of these factors. So it has been concluded that up to 80% of females living in Karachi, Pakistan, suffer from vitamin D3 deficiency. And for shorthand, when you see it as it is on the screen here, VIT-D with a little d after it, that means vitamin D3 deficiency. Okay, so 80% is a very large number. And the fact that it's much higher for women than for men is both predictable and disturbing in all of the obvious ways. So this is a point of departure for me from here to try to get a little bit deeper into this question of, well, how bad is that then? If 80% of women in Karachi, which is, a mega city of tens of millions, if they feel that there's a vitamin D3 deficiency, what is that going to do? What's the problem? Well, this deficiency is associated with the proper functioning of vital organ systems in all of us. It helps to regulate calcium and phosphorus levels in the blood, which is essential. It is directly related to antibody production in ways that I totally don't understand, but I believe that is still true. It is connected to adaptive immune function. It is related to bone mineralization in children, which is why it's historically so strongly associated with rickets, which is a bone development problem for infants and children in particular. And this is my sort of like sub headline, it turns out that vitamin D3 is related to assorted complex ways that we offer resistance to a list of important things like cancer, type 1 diabetes, neurological disorders, strokes, depression, and COVID-19. That's the late breaking news, because who was tracking this connection until recently, right? So these are really, really big issues. All of these are really big issues. So if 80% of the women in Karachi don't have enough vitamin D3 to go around, they are much more vulnerable and susceptible to all kinds of other systemic problems that are related to the bullets on this list. And of course, there's other comorbidity factors that go along with that, as with anything. So we're just talking about one element in a complex chain, but it is a significant element. All right. So I mentioned rickets. Rickets is the thing that is most often associated with sunlight and vitamin D3 deficiency. And basically, let's not worry about all of these details. Let's just say that many studies agree that in Southeast Asia, the prevalence among children is around 15%. I mean, that's just a massive number, right? When you think about something as fundamental as vitamin D3 and all of those things that it's linked to. And so the first thing that often you see and feel and experience with children in this situation is this thing called rickets, where their bones are soft, curved, deformed, etc. It's really not good. It can be, you can recover from rickets, but there's, all these other cascading problems that come with it. Okay, so let me just cut to the chase a little bit here. A year and a half ago, a team in Spain finally said, all right, we're in the middle of a pandemic. Let's look at COVID and vitamin D3 deficiency. And I've thrown up on the screen this unforgivably boring chart from that study. And you can see the citation up above. It's a paper worth looking at for those of you who are really interested in this. I think it's probably the most clear evidence yet produced for the direct linkage between vitamin D3 deficiency and COVID susceptibility. And so there's a link that I think Hillary can share with you eventually that can take you to that paper, if for those of you who are interested. But here's the upshot. The upshot is we have on the black bars, people who were hospitalized for COVID-19 in this Spanish study. And then the gray bars are sort of the regular control, the regular people. The black bars, the ones that say 36.5 and 45.7, say to us that, and we have vitamin D3 levels on the horizontal axis. Sorry, I forgot to mention that. The upshot is people who are deficient in vitamin D3 go to the hospital for COVID much, much more often than their peers that don't have vitamin D3 deficiency. So equalized for age and gender and all that stuff, which they do with these studies. People without vitamin D3 are so much more likely to be hospitalized with COVID. Now, we don't quite understand exactly what that all means. Why? I mean, it's not so much that they get COVID less. It seems that they're hospitalized for it. So it seems to strike them. It seems to hurt them more. And that makes sense because we know that vitamin D3 is deeply involved with immune response. So here's evidence, hard recent evidence that shows that there is a clear, unambiguous linkage between these two things. So in other words, add it to the list of reasons why we should care about vitamin D3. Okay, so can I dig us out of this hole that I've gotten us into, going down into the weeds with all this stuff about vitamin D3? Because I'm not really here to talk about vitamin D3. I'm a terrible person to talk about that. My colleagues in the medicine domain are the best people to talk about that. I'm here to talk about what architects can do about it. Well, in essence, I think anyone can see already what the connection is. Architects and urban planners can build spaces that provide more or less access to direct sunlight. I'm talking about everything. I'm talking about houses, workplaces, roads, sidewalks, plazas, terraces, everything you might imagine. And I think we have a lot to contribute to a more equal and democratized access to sunlight for those who are needing it, who are in a low light cast. And along these lines, many of you here will be very familiar, maybe annoyingly familiar with this particular thing. This is called Maslow's Pyramid. And it's just a simple way of understanding a basic idea, which is in this world, so Maslow argued, and it seems true to me, it's sort of like first things first. Like, you can't talk about what you think about, an existentialist French play if you're starving and you're just so hungry. You're gonna only be thinking about food, and you can't talk about a fancy French play. And that's a dumb way of talking about Maslow's pyramid. But basically, the bottom level is physiological needs. That those come first. Until you've met those, you don't get to graduate and worry about the stuff up above. Up above would be safety. Above that is belonging and being loved and loving and feeling like you're connected to other people. You have intimate relationships. We all want that. That's wonderful. But Maslow's pyramid says you're not even going to worry about that if you are shivering with cold, or you don't know where you're going to sleep, or you're really thirsty, or you can't take a shower, or you don't feel safe, like where you're sitting or sleeping. this is obviously not some kind of ironclad rule, but you get the idea. So at the very top of our pyramid is the beautiful land where people worry about self-actualization. Who am I? What is the meaning of life? Am I doing the best work that I could possibly be doing? Will I get that job at Google? That's fine. But that's stuff that if you're going to be worrying about that, the Maslow's Pyramid suggests that you've got all the other layers taken care of, which most people working at Google probably do. But what we're talking about, of course, is life down in the blue zone, in the blue-purple zone. So I want to circle back, if I can, to my original slightly cranky remarks about architecture as a field, because that's where I'm relatively on solid ground here. Not totally solid, but relatively. So the way architecture as a field, I'm not talking about individuals as much as the sort of ego of the field in general, the way it usually thinks about itself, talks about itself, boasts about itself, reflects on itself, is up in the green zone. That's where I'm saying that's where the actual ego life of architecture in the Western tradition lives. It's about, who are you? What kind of a person are you? Do you want a bungalow or do you want a modern house? Or, how do you feel? Does this make you feel proud? Or does this, all of that stuff? Great. But that's way up in the nosebleed seats of Maslow's pyramid. I'm trying to argue this evening that where we need to be, where we should be, is down here with fulfilling the basic needs of the majority of people who are in need. And let's face it, the first job of architecture is to keep, the elements away from you and to give you privacy and a place to have a conversation and a place to rest and be yourself. That's the basics of architecture, not how it looks on the cover of a magazine, or if it's cool, or if it's in style, or if it's, exotic. But architects don't tend to talk about their work in terms of fulfilling those basic needs. Their work does often fulfill those needs. Don't get me wrong. It does a lot of the time, but they don't talk about it that way, and they don't assess the results of their own projects that way. And that's where I'm really making I hope to make a somewhat concrete set of suggestions here. So basically, just to summarize a little bit, in terms of vitamin D3 deficiency, we know this is the cascade of ideas that we know unambiguously, that direct sunlight is the primary stimulant. And more than 1 billion people globally are probably vitamin D3 deficient. If you add up all the stats, that's what it's looking like. So it has been said, not just by me, it has been said that this is a man-made global pandemic, vitamin D3 deficiency. But even if you don't agree with that, wild language, it's a huge problem that is causing a lot of suffering in the world. And of course, buildings and public spaces are social determinants of health with respect to vitamin D3. Now, it is true, and it will be said, that you can take vitamin D3 orally. We can take any vitamin orally, basically. So we can just say, I don't need sunlight anymore. I'm just going to take my pill every morning and I'm good. That is great. It's so great that that's possible. That wasn't always possible. It's been revolutionary to be able to get vitamin D3 into people's systems. But there are issues with that pharmacological approach to it. And we don't need to go into the details, but it's not a perfect system. Just like getting a lot of people, billions of people, to take any pill every day or every other day is never an easy thing. There's a whole bunch of reasons why that's true. So let's just say there's a chain of events here, okay? I want to digress one more time, and I promise that this is probably my last major digression. I mentioned that I wanted to also not just talk about like sort of current architecture, which is highly problematic in relation to the light casts that I've been referring to. I also want to talk about old architecture. Old architecture, historic architecture, is considered quaint and beautiful by some, annoying and sort of too expensive by others. But I'd like to talk about it in relation to our subject just for 1 minute, please. The way I want to talk about it is in terms of transcriptive conservation. And I mean, when I say transcriptive, I just mean borrowing the architectural solutions from successful buildings that are often old and transplanting that as a design concept or as a design detail into new construction. So I'm not talking about preserving old buildings or fixing them. I'm talking about looking at them and saying, oh, the reason why this old building was so well loved, the reason why it lasted so long is because its roof detail is great. It has these great special shingles, and they've always shed the rain really well so that the timbers don't get wet. And that's why it's 800 years old. So that would be one example of like, okay, so the really key detail here, the thing that like made it work so well was, let's say, the way the roof was built. So for people who live in a rainy place, you'd be wise to study that roof detail of that old surviving building very carefully, because they did something right. The proof is in the pudding. And we would like to study that and transcribe that roof detail. Let's say it's a shingle detail. We'd like to transcribe that into our blueprint of our new thing. And so we want to benefit from this wildly successful detail of this proven excellent building. Okay. It turns out that in the field of biology, in the way our cells reproduce, this happens a million times a second, which is mind-boggling. And the way it happens is what I'm showing on the screen now. There's something called RNA polymerase, and it's like a cool little car. And when you need something, like you need to grow your fingernail a little bit longer, it says, okay, we need fingernail cells. We got to produce a whole bunch of those guys. So here we go. And they go down and they go into the DNA strand, the double helix, and they unzip it to get to the point where there's that information that's specific to fingernail cells. And they unzip it and they make a copy of it, and it's incredibly amazing and elaborate. And that's what polymerase does. It's the thing that says, right, we need more blood cells, we need more hair cells, we need more saliva, we need more whatever. I'm going to go get the information. And it's this wildly long strand, right? It's the DNA that's got every bit of information about the whole package, and they just need the fingernail information. And you know what? They're so good at it. They go in and they get it and they copy it and they come back and they say, I got it, guys. We got the information to build all the fingernails you want. Let's do it. And they do it. And that's what happens. That's called transcription. Okay. It's happening all the time. Somehow it's a miracle. Okay. In architecture, I say we can do this too. Instead of just admiring old buildings or putting a dome of glass over them or knocking them down and being frustrated with them, we could say, hey, what do we like about this building? What worked? And we could transcribe it just like the RNA polymerase goes in. And instead of going into the whole DNA strand and getting the fingernail information, we're going into a whole building and we're saying it's a great building, but the thing that's really great about it is the transom and the floorboards and the roof tiles. So we got to get that, and we're going to go put that into our brand new building on the other side of town. That's another view. That's another way to conserve historic architecture, by conserving individual, discretely excellent details and putting them into new design. So they live on, just like, every new fingernail cell for you is a new fingernail cell, but it's based on the beautiful old blueprint that's inside the DNA strand, right? Okay, so cool. So I guess what I'm saying is, hey, we can do this. For instance, here's Hyderabad, also in Pakistan. We have these funny things on the roof. Those funny things on the roof are wind catches. And they all face the same direction, as you can see, because there's a prevailing wind in most of these cities. And you know what? That wind comes in, it's shot down a flue, and it hits a shallow pool in the courtyard on the base floor of these houses. And it's natural air conditioning, and it's been done since the dynastic period of Egypt. We know that because we have clay models that they made of their houses, and they have wind catches. This is a great idea. This is low-tech, high-efficiency air conditioning, and why we decided that strapping a weird metal box that drips on the outside of a building was a better idea. Why we did that, I just don't know. This is a good example of something we should still be using in places in the world where it's really hot and there's a prevailing breeze. And it works just like this, and it does it all really perfectly. It ventilates the house, it cools the house, it pushes out stale, hot air. It does all the things you would want it to do, as long as you get the basic design right, which is not rocket science. By the way, when we think about a flow of good ventilation like this, we can also think about all the benefits of that fresh air for people's health, right? I mean, it feels good and that's nice, but it's also good for air quality and everything. That's pretty obvious, right? Here's a root cellar, another great idea that we should all be doing. Why pay for a refrigerator to keep all your vegetables cool when there's some part of your house or your land that could be the same temperature all the time without an outlet being plugged in? Here's something called an inglenook. It's a cool idea. Why? Because it keeps the warmth generated by the fire in a small alcove a little bit longer than it would be kept in an open room. And that's good for the people sitting on those cool arts and crafts style little benches there. That's a great place to have a conversation. And that's good for your mental health, because now you've just spent a half an hour chatting with your cousin about that French theater that you were dying to get to, and you were comfortable and you were having fun and you sort of didn't want to leave because it's so cozy in the Inglenook. So you stayed and listened a little bit longer to your cousin tell you about all of their ideas about French theater. That's good. That's being human. So Inglenooks, why did that go out of style? That's a great idea. Okay, and there's something even better than Inglenooks. There's the traditional Chinese rural stove bench bed thing. It's amazing. It's one continuous block of masonry where you can see this nice woman is creating her little fire in there. She's going to cook on top of that first part, but grandpa over there is hanging out on the kind of bench table / couch thing, and that's all continuously heated by the fire. It's all radiant heat because it's just warming up that entire mass of concrete. And this is a great design. We never should have stopped doing this. It's so good that there was this photographer recently who went around rural China just taking pictures of people sitting on their super warm, radiant bed stoves. And this is people just happily sitting on their awesome bed stoves. So one of the things I wanted to also point out is that when we ignore this as built environment professionals, the cost of bad design, the cost of things that promote chronic illnesses is very high. In the same way that all things that promote chronic illness is high. Cigarettes created a cost that was a public burden. That's probably half the reason why they eventually made them illegal, because the cost just got too high of allowing this stupid, unhealthy thing to happen, right? A lot of architectural designs are equally guilty, probably. US built environment professionals, I would like to point out, to our shame, were not designated at the outset of COVID-19 as essential workers. Lots of people were essential workers, bus drivers, nurses, of course, teachers, all kinds of people. It all makes perfect sense. I'm all for it. For some interesting reason, and not really a bad reason, architects were not on that list. Why not? If my argument is correct that their designs are essential to making the air fresher and people feel warm or not getting enough sunlight, if all of that is so true, they should have been right up there with the nurses and doctors and cab drivers or bus drivers or whatever. They were not mentioned on that list. And that's consistent with their optic conscience as people who are just designing things that look cool or not. Medical journals throughout hundreds of years have cited the crucial role of housing design for the well-being of their patients. Patients who are too cold in the winter, too hot in the summer, don't have fresh air to breathe. They say over and over again, I need my patients to be warmer or cooler or have more fresh air, but I can't prescribe that. I'm a doctor. I can't give them that. Please, architects, where are you? Can you please build better affordable housing? And you know what? It was a big silent nothing that they got back over and over again. Housing design in relation to training and evaluation could be imagined and theorized as a special branch of public health praxis. That last chunk right there, that is basically that's my bottom line this evening. That's sort of where you're either gonna, feel like, you totally agree with this and this is an awesome idea and we should all run out into the streets and make it happen, or you're gonna think this was sort of a waste of your evening. That, I believe, is true. I'm asserting that we could and should reimagine ourselves as a profession, as a branch of public health practice, not as designers of beautiful objects in space, which is essentially how it's been. So what do doctors do? I mean, they use tools like this. I think I could easily imagine the equivalent of this in architecture. This is like thermal regulation. This is like thinking about how well your building keeps people warm in cold season and cool in the warm season. We can test this. We know better and worse ways to do this in architecture. But what we don't do is measure how cold or how warm people are in the buildings that we design. We never go and ask. We don't take their temperature. Can you imagine how stupid that is? It's like a doctor saying, you look like you might be feverish. I don't know, you look a little red. Anyway, good luck to you. Where's the thermometer? We too are basically saying, I think that's a nice looking building. I'm not sure really how it works in terms of living there, but good luck. So we could totally measure that. We have the equivalent of a thermometer. How about the stethoscope? I think that's for, checking how well your heart is pumping blood. And I think one of the things blood does is bring oxygen to your whole body. People in buildings need oxygen too. They need fresh air. We can talk about ventilation. We can talk about how prevalent aerosols, including COVID virus, whatever particles, how they're doing, where they're moving. Are they moving? Are they in the house? Are they out of the house? We can regulate the movement of oxygen and other aerosols in the house. We know how to do it, and we know how to do it well, but we never ask. We don't go and measure where is the air moving in this building and how well and how are people feeling and is anybody getting sick? I mean, we'll respond if someone's terribly ill at death's door, but architects do not consistently go and put their stethoscope on. What other metaphors can I strain this evening? How about blood sampling? Doctors use blood samples all the time to figure out what's going on inside someone's body. We can do that too. We can measure people's vitamin D3 levels and then figure out, whether we're doing a good job of getting them sunlight or not. We have the equivalent of that as well. So in the end, my assertion is that we should assess the value of architectural designs based on measurable health utility, psychological and physical. We can do it. We have the tools to do it, but we choose in our field not to measure that. That is crazy. We could collaborate with physicians to address the needs of people who live and work in these buildings within a network of medical specialists, and we too could understand ourselves as medical specialists. And finally, we could accept responsibility for spatial conditions which promote communicable disease and human vulnerability. We could admit that our designs sometimes really backfire, and we could work to mitigate those things. Those are all things that architects and planners could do, but I am here to argue that that is not what they are being trained to do in school. This is what architects should do. They should go back to the buildings and say, how's it going? Let me see how you're feeling and doing. This would be the proper kind of feedback to make our designs better. We do not go back and check. We do not go back and ask the questions that any physician would ask of anybody they saw. So essentially, we need a prescription. We need to help our colleagues in the medical field to write this prescription. And the only people who can really consistently fulfill this in an affordable way, long-term, large scale, are built environment professionals. And we're not there. We're not responding. We're not able to fill this prescription, but we know how to do it. So there you are. That's essentially my point of view on this. And I would just like to, in my final slide, just put back my title slide, but I'm adding in this red chunk. So instead of architects as essential healthcare workers, it's more like, can we imagine them that way? Because we're a long way from that right now. But my hope is that through conversations like this and many, many more, we could arrive at a point where we were actually collaborating, working together to make, people feel better and to avoid avoidable illnesses. So that's it. That's all I've got. And I really appreciate your time. And I think maybe there might be some questions, or maybe Susan and I can chat a little bit about all of this stuff.
Hey, John, maybe you could just pause on this, on the sharing of your screen. I'll get Susan up here for you.
Great. Got it.
John, that was absolutely fantastic. Absolutely fantastic. And as you know, my original thought was that I might take advantage of having been invited to talk with you directly, of lobbing the first questions at you. But I have to tell you, the chat room is exploding. And I'm going to propose that we reverse this a little bit. I'll go last instead of first, because there are so many people wanting to talk with you about so many different ideas. One thing I would say before we jump into that is your focus has been very much on the built environment professional, architects, in cooperation with medical professionals. I think, which I think is a fantastic idea. There are two disciplines whose time has come and gone and come again, and it is here now. It resonates a lot with a lot of discussions in aging in place, and particularly talking about built environments with people with cognitive changes, particularly memory decline in mind. That's what I want to come back to. But before I do, I want to point out that actually architects, physicians, physical therapists, occupational therapists, social workers, that multidisciplinary team is really what, and I think now we prefer interprofessional team, are really the folks who are addressing what we now know to be most central to health and well-being, and that is the social determinants of health. You know, for those of you who don't know me, but you heard when we came in, I'm a physician, and yet I have come to appreciate, and the data supports it, that my contribution as a physician, medical contribution to the overall health and wellness of a person is about 20%, 30%. Social determinants of health are about 40, and the rest is lifestyle or genes. So that notion of the social determinants of health being so central and bringing the key players together is really where I'd like to see us go with the conversation. And boy, the questions in here are fabulous. I'm not sure which one to go to first, but I think what I would like to do with Hillary's help is scroll through them here. And while I'm doing that, I wonder if you could comment on something that I find very interesting, and Tom has also commented on in the chat box. You know, back in the day, buildings designed for older adults were very utilitarian, institutional, tile floors because people were going to be incontinent. You wanted to be able to clean them up easily. And there was this hospital-like environment, institutional environment, lots of ways to describe it. And then we shifted into, and are shifting now into this, let's make it comfy, more home-like, comfortable in that way. But one of the dimensions that I think is missing is making it feel safe. That second rung up in Maslow, whom you've pointed out. And while we have really emphasized, particularly when people move into, say, a nursing home, we've emphasized bring some things from home so it feels home-like, or feels homey, or it is your home now. I think we essentially miss something about the relationship to being able to move about in that space. To me, that's more the essence of home. So I wonder if you could speak to the notion of safety beyond the kind of floor surfaces we have, but that real lived experience of feeling safe in your environment. And I'd love to hear you comment on that.
Yeah, I'd be happy to, Susan. That's not something I've thought a lot about, but it's a really good question. My sense is, you know, since it's on my mind, and I was talking about that idea of transcribing good, discrete design solutions from the entire archive of great buildings that are out there, and just making sure we're using the best, you know, we've got the best solution to problem X. If one of the problems might be avoiding a fall, I'm just picking that out of a hat. If we looked at just the historic built environment, we would probably find 50 outstanding, excellent, time-proven domestic designs that maybe weren't even done exactly for that reason, but they work really well for older people in a certain environment. We would just find them. I can't quite imagine exactly what the design would be, but we would be able to say, hey, you know, empirically, older people thrive and do well and choose to be in this kind of environment over many generations in, you know, whatever, Scotland or, you know, Japan, I don't know, wherever it is. And we can go in and we can say, it seems to be linked to this, and this aspect of their environment. It may be about visibility, right? It may be that the illumination is really good so they don't stumble in on something that would have, maybe it's about, you know, floor coverings. Maybe it's about level changes, obviously. But I guess my first thought is, if we were looking as architects, if we were looking at our work as a sort of living encyclopedia of discrete, you might say almost like genes, the genes of good architecture, not whole buildings. Whole buildings are the wrong unit with which to talk about architecture. Do you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. The right unit is an individual thing that is working, a really good door, a really good set of stairs, a really good heating system. Yeah, you know, putting them together as one building is where it ultimately has to go. But we should be looking at it in terms of genes and groups of genes, not in terms of my house, your house, and the Seagram's building in Manhattan. That doesn't make any sense. That doesn't help anybody. So first of all, we want to steal those things. And second of all, I just feel like, older adults probably have, a lot of ideas themselves from their own life history about the kind of spaces that they enjoy or have enjoyed. And I just think a lot of times no one bothers to ask them. It's more like, let us tell you how this is going to work. We've got this big bar in your shower, and maybe, whatever, maybe that doesn't work for them. So I just think that just like you would ask a patient about their history to figure out, all of their habits, we should talk to people about space and their relationships to it, because it's not one size fits all.
Amen to that, John. That's, I think, in addition to sort of looking at the social determinants of health, the phrase you can't get away from in age-friendly healthcare is the notion of person-centeredness. Ask them what matters most is sort of the mantra. So good point with that. One of the questions that came up in the box, John, has to do with the whole tiny house movement. And there's a little bit of back and forth in the chat box about whether that's the essence of condensed essential design in a house and where it fits with the sort of whole public health notion, or whether it's the opposite of it. Could you comment on tiny houses, please?
I think it's a great development. I think it's long overdue. Like a lot of things, like hybrid cars or something, these great solutions are at first only accessible to the wealthy. And so tiny houses, while they're wonderful and efficient as houses, they typically are actually hard to afford for a lot of people, simply because, you have to have the land and everything to put them on. So I love them. I think they're a terrific thing. They're not at this moment a very relevant solution to the majority of people that I've been referring to today, the people who are stuck living in big urban areas with a lot of oppressive and dangerous architecture, just for the obvious reasons that, you can't just bring your little tiny house down the lane and sort of set it up. So for Americans, for middle class, well-to-do Americans, I think it's probably one of the best housing solutions around. We live in houses that are too big. We can't be in 18 rooms at once. We can be in one room at once. It would be better to have one really nice room than 18 mediocre rooms, 17 of which you're not in. So I just think that that's a great idea. It makes perfect sense. And we should enjoy the kind of Walden-like quality of the tiny house movement. It was good for Thoreau. I think it's good for all of us. I think it's very healthy. In terms of the majority of people who really desperately need help with better environments domestically live in megacities, and they are the least affluent and the least economically mobile. We also need to figure out how to work with them where they are, how they are. And I know that's a concept that comes up in your work a lot. Like, you could list a bunch of wonderful things of how to live and how to be, but you've got to meet people where they are, right? And so I figure that architects are good at coming up with sort of beautiful, discrete designs. The icky, boring part of that is, how do you bring that to scale for people in a diverse array of complex physical locations and everything? And I'm sure there is some version of tiny houses that could work, even in Karachi, for example. We could helicopter them in and put them on the top of existing buildings. I'm all for it, but that would require architects and others to take it seriously as a solution at scale, and not just as a vignette, as a sort of like charming image, which is, again, my original complaint, that architects are feeding on images all the time. And there's some very seductive images of tiny houses. I'm seduced by them. I'd like one, but that's not the same as a affordable solution at scale. And that's what we're looking for, a sort of a vaccine type thing, not a single cure for a single person.
Thank you. There was a comment in the chat box also, not so much a question, but a comment by somebody, and I'm hoping that you'll speak up. I don't know who it is, but I think it might be you, Ellen, about how much this resonates for you with the idea of financial health as well. Would you be willing to talk about that?
Sure. Finance and banking and all of these things have never been regarded as relevant to health. On the other hand, over the course of the last 10 years or so, the connection, mainly through stress, has really become very much a part of the conversation around social determinants of health. So in addition to the notion of physicians writing prescriptions for healthy foods or a good environment. By the way, my video doesn't work, so I'm not turning it on. You also are seeing some very interesting collaborations among financial services providers, their nonprofit partners, and health systems. And so it's very much the same kind of idea.
Thank you very much. Hillary, I think we best let some other folks who want to ask questions in.
Yes, I think anyone who wants to ask a question, you're welcome to turn on your sound and your video. This would be a great time to pose any of the questions or make any of the comments. I saw some really wonderful links that people were posting. So please do. Thank you.
Well, we're waiting for hands to be raised. Jon, I just wanted to say, I don't know if you saw the study that was just released from Israel this week, confirming that same correlation that was observed in the paper that you told us about from Spain from 21. This was, I'm not sure exactly when it was published. I just saw it this week. It was released in all the sort of throwaway med magazines. But in addition to there being this correlation between vitamin D deficiency and getting sicker from COVID, it is also very clear now that that one is more susceptible to getting it. So higher incidence, worst case, and higher rates of mortality. So to really underscore your point, it's just the evidence keeps accumulating.
Wow, I haven't seen that, and I'll look forward to reading it. And I wish it wasn't so, but yeah, it does seem really, really clear. And when one has the tools with which to take a hit, to take a chunk out of a problem like that, it just feels like a moral obligation to do that. And I just think that this is an interesting moment, that maybe the pandemic can have a sort of silver lining in that maybe it'll help some of these things to get more traction than they might have if it was just business as usual. That's a sort of wish that I feel.
It's absolutely a wish that I share, I must say. COVID-19, I think you said in a paper that you wrote that I read in your abstract, that COVID-19 has jolted us out of many of our faulty assumptions. And what I'm also often say is that COVID-19 has shone a very bright light on many health disparities, inequities, and ageism. And that creates an opportunity.
Yes.
We are jarred, we're disruptive. This is a transformative moment. And I got to tell you, if I haven't said it already, that transcriptive conscription metaphor is brilliant. I love it.
Thanks. It was done out of desperation because I went to graduate school to study historic preservation of architecture, and it became so frustrating to only see people treating fancy buildings with fancy Botox, basically, and never thinking about them in their component parts. It just seems like it's so basic, it's so simple. And yet, again, my field writ large seems to have a major mental block about actually, receiving feedback, like what worked and what didn't. I mean, it feels very, kind of sophomoric to me to not want to hear the parts that don't work because nothing's perfect, right? But basically, there's this field that sort of is sort of like has this ongoing problem with sort of understanding how to do mid-course corrections and make their designs better, or worse, they sort of form a little coven and they just hand out prizes to each other for beauty contest prizes. This is very anemic and very problematic. And so that's just one more way in which I fear that the field that I'm speaking from needs to go through kind of a sea change of some kind, because the way it's built, the equivalent of medical school, if we were inside an architecture school right now, for the most part, it is in no way built to absorb and metabolize the information we're talking about. And we're not talking about anything complex here. This is pretty elementary stuff, but architecture schools can't do it. It's like it's oil and water. They're not built to do that. And so it's worrisome because how are we going to do more collaboration with people who aren't even, speaking that same language. It's a question that I have, and I worry about it, but I mean, you got to start somewhere. So maybe one thing we do is maybe we co-write some papers that are, little prodding papers, in the side of both of our fields, but especially mine. I feel like mine has the further distance to travel. And maybe that's the start of a conversation, a sort of a provocative conversation. I don't know.
Yeah,
That's
that's
the beauty of
interesting.
tonight.
Can I hop in for a sec?
Yeah,
I think
please.
Jean Paderak might have something to add that's quite related to what John was just talking about. And then Rosalind Derby has a question afterwards.
Great.
So I just wanted to chime in on a couple of things. I mean, having worked in the architecture field for a hot minute, for a couple of years, not as an architect, but and I was on the board for Architects, which is a lecture series that takes place here every April in Portland that brings in architects from other parts of the world. And I have some of the same problems with the kind of, glossy, sexy covers and the kind of awards that always go to beauty without paying attention. And I'm especially horrified with what I see going on in Portland. But getting back to the elderly, housing and safety, having moved a parent from independent living to nursing care. I mean, one thing I think that we're going to keep bumping up, and in fact, I made a comment here about capitalism. We're putting a lot of blame on the architects, where I really think a lot of the blame needs to go to the fact that we have bottom line developers, and almost every architecture project is going to run into the problem that it costs too much money and they scale back. But especially when we get into healthcare and institutions, you're going to have that problem again and again, because not only are the corporations themselves trying to make money, but the developers trying to make money, and then everybody's getting squished. And then there's a whole thing of care, the actual cost of care. But nursing homes, and more so than independent livings, there's also just the fact that usually they try to put more than one person in a space. And that right there is going to cause problems for elderly people, because they need to remember where things are. And when somebody puts their walker in front of them where they're not supposed to be, then there's going to be a problem. They're going to run into other people's things. And there's too many people moving through one space, so they don't have the autonomy of their space, which I think is really important. The other thing is things get programmed in, like outdoor spaces, but then there could be a beautiful courtyard with beautiful gardens, but there's not going to be staff to take the people out into the space. So there's a problem, because, oh yeah, there's this beautiful courtyard. They can sell you this nice nursing home space. But then when you realize your parent is there and they never go outside because nobody will take them outside, it's really sad. So I think I do think that until we have better, lobbyists, like wanting to take care of people instead of the lobbyists always working for Wall Street and the bottom line, we're always going to be up against these problems. Whereas maybe where, like I pointed out, the most recent Pritzker Prize went to an African man just now in 2022. It was announced like yesterday or the day before, and part of that is he was doing it, the motivation, building schools and other buildings in Africa, low cost, very big importance on having classrooms that could have light. And so it can be done. We know that architects are smart, they have all the tools. All of this can be done, but in our country, we're always going to be up against the problem of money. So that's my point.
Thank you.
Hey,
Rosalind.
Rosalind, did you have a question to ask?
Yeah, I was just wanting I was very much enjoying this perspective on architecture. I'm an architect myself. But in regard to, solutions, and the Pritzker Prize winners last year, 21, were Vassal and Lacaton, they're French. Their whole premise of when I first started practicing was never demolish, never demolish, never demolish. And when you first saw examples of their work, when they were promoting their award, were these massive French, housing estates, which were just these big grey blocks. And you thought, what? What's with this? And then what they did was completely convert them as the improved places for people to live. I mean, these were people who were permanent tenants, the culture of never owning your own house or your life. And these people stayed in these buildings while the work was being done. But all they did was wrap around these metal verandas, like right around the whole building, so that the internal flats would then open up to this kind of open veranda. And they were sort of like just interventions in the spaces of these small flats. And they were, it was all about the light, like you're talking about, John, bringing in light and fresh air, but also by having this veranda right. It's just like a skeleton around the whole of this typically bland council multi-story flat. And it was award-winning not because necessarily the look of it, but because of what it achieved. And I guess everybody having their own, it would create community outside your flat as well. I mean, I haven't seen them up close, but it was important enough to provide them with a Pritzker Prize.
I love that example. And for those of you who don't know, the Pritzker Prize is the highest award in architecture. I love that example because it's so simple and beautiful, and it probably made a major difference in the quality of life for those people who probably felt that their quality of life in terms of architecture could never change, but there it did change. And another awesome example of how brilliant architects can be when they want to solve a problem like that. I mean, there's no question, there's just unlimited firepower there. It's more about like just where the gun is being aimed or something. So if we could just keep firing shots like that one, which probably was relatively cheap as architectural interventions go, man, I mean, we'd be living on a different planet right now if more people, prioritize that kind of intervention. And I happen to agree that I think almost every time you retain existing fabric and you work with it, you let it be your basis. And that's also energetically really smart because there's so much embodied energy in a single masonry wall. We don't want to waste that unless we absolutely have to. So I think that's a great example.
Because aesthetically, you just miss it if you're looking for these sort of beautiful award-winning buildings.
Right.
Particularly at the ground floor, you're not even looking up. And if when you're getting away and you're looking at it from a distance from a one of those things that fly around in the air,
drones, yeah.
You would still kind of dismiss it of that you don't want to be judgmental of the inhabitants, but you're just judgmental of the architecture. And if you demolish the whole thing, imagine that in terms of the huge issue around carbon energy and things like that. So they solved a lot of things. But what they were saying, the elements, it wasn't, a lot of these verandas were just sort of like galvanized steel posts with like metal sort of framing around. But the architecture was the light they were bringing in and the access to the outside they were bringing in. It was all of those things that you were talking about.
That's brilliant. I'd love to see that project. It's brilliant. Great example.
Thank you, Rosalind. That's so amazing. If you have a link or anything like that you can put into the chat, I will try
to do it now.
That would be amazing. Thank you. We would love to see that. There's a really good question about zoning from Tom Muser. Tom, if you could pop in.
Thanks, Hillary. So it's my perception, maybe I'm wrong, that local zoning and building code requirements might actually sometimes be an impediment to building these kind of healthy home spaces that you're suggesting, John. Am I correct in that perception, or what are your thoughts on that topic?
Zoning is as much of a barricade as an aid in a lot of ways, for the reason that one of the participants just pointed out. It's part of the developer's sort of like kit. It's zoning and codes are sometimes just about good old fashioned health and safety, but a lot of times they're tweaked towards the market in some way. It's just one of the corrupt elements of the whole building trade. So as it was pointed out, we're talking about a wasp's nest of different pieces that, banks and developers and then architects and everything. And, you got to get them all to move sort of in synchrony for something to happen. And that just feels overwhelming. So I agree that codes can get in the way. Of course, codes also make sure that, we don't have favelas and, endless slums. It's a double-edged sword, but let's just put it simply that most codes, we've all probably encountered codes in some way with, places where we've lived, maybe they typically just mean that things are a little bit more difficult and expensive to do. And that's not always a bad thing, but in some ways it just means that construction and new ideas and innovations just take so long to get realized. Like from the moment of conceiving of a good idea to having it implemented at scale in an urban environment, to essentially adjust the codes to accommodate some new thing, like let's say, I don't know, solar shingles or something like that, whatever. It's too long. It's like you can't wait that long. I mean, it feels these days like we don't have time to wait for anything at all, but like certainly we don't have time to wait for a bunch of bureaucrats to like scratch their heads and decide eventually, that like maybe they'll allow something that's obviously good or potentially good. So I guess my reaction to your question is just, it would take a full court press to make this happen at scale and in a time frame where we're not all going to be exhausted and flustered by it. We need to look at all of these pieces. There's really smart people out there that analyze this stuff all the time, and we need to have a strategy that's equally complex. I mean, that's a very, very tall order, because any one of these elements, the mortgage lending industry, the developer profit motive, which is insidious, the codes, the historic preservationists who go crazy, all of this stuff, any one of these could just puncture, the tire of one of these plans. But knowing that, if we were very lucky and clever and we worked hard, we could foresee this stuff, we could plan for it, and we could have an approach that would work. So, I mean, it is a tall order. It's a complex business, but if we keep giving in, surrendering to the status quo, let's just call the existing codes, the status quo. Like if we keep just sort of saying, I can't fight that. I mean, I can't fight City Hall. I'm just going to work with what I've got. That's not really going to work for people very much longer. It's really broken. It's been broken for a while, but I think what Susan, you were sort of saying is now the brokenness is so, it's really bleeding now. Like it was obviously not a great system before, but COVID sort of, shoved it to that next level of acuteness or something. And I don't know how much longer we can all collectively afford to just kind of let sleeping dogs lie here. I mean, this is a system that is desperately not good for just millions, maybe billions of people worldwide. It's a mind-boggling scale. So the time is long past for us to sort of take some risks and make some challenging proposals. And I guess we just have to hope that we are collectively clever enough to navigate all of these slalom course, turns that are inevitable and part of the system.
Great, thank you. Who else has a question? You can turn on your video and your sound if you'd like to ask something. If not, Susan may have another point to make. I'm not sure.
One of the things that I've been really interested in as I've been listening to everyone, particularly Rosalind, your description of that transformation of that building, is that I have tended to think about these verandas or open spaces, places you can get out to, in terms of light, in terms of air, and in terms of community, that there is a sort of, and that little nook that you showed with, two people going in there to get warm can have a conversation, that sort of thing, like building spaces that promote connection, promote exposure to and participation in the natural world. But the thing that I thought about tonight was that it also gives you access simply to looking at the sky. And I was reminded of some of the work being done now in the sort of work on resilience and recovery about the need physically to reopen our psychological space because of the true impact of 2 years of stress from COVID, from all of the social unrest, all the things we've been talking about. Now we've got a war in addition, another war to worry about. And so it's really had quite an impact on our brains. And one of the things that's part of the healing is to reopen what has been this shutting down protectively And, you know, I'm always telling people, look out your window and look at the sky. If you can't get outside, look at the sky. But it really hit home when Rosalind was describing that building. Said it's not just light, it's not just air, it's not community, it's space. And you said the same thing about Rothko, that, you know, that it's a psychic space kind of thing. So I hadn't really thought about that. Sky as space, psychological space, and Rothko as psychic space. But anything you want to do with any of that, John? Not really an exact question, but it really has me thinking about space itself.
It's music to my ears, Susan. I have nothing to add except that I feel the same way. And there is a very beautiful metaphysical component to this, of course, as there is always with art and architecture. And it's a total win-win situation. The kinds of solutions that we're talking about, while they are very pragmatically relevant to things like vitamin D3 deficiency, a fairly, you know, prosaic topic, also have that poetic component. It's like the sign of a really good solution is that it does multiple things at once. Isn't that kind of true?
That's really true. You know, we throw around these phrases all the time, particularly at our osteopathic medical school: whole person health, mind, body, spirit. But then you come up against something like this and you say, oh, what we're talking about is really true. It's not just a throwaway phrase. And when you get a solution that hits it all, you've got a human scale solution that is scalable to all humans. And yeah, so I think it's true.
Yeah, I'm with you. I think that's just the nature of the beast. And so that maybe one of the big incentives for this difficult problem that we're grappling with here and imagining is that if we could begin to look in a direction that would start getting it right, at least experimentally, chances are the benefits would be even greater than the ones that we've been talking about this evening, which are significant in their own right. But I think that they would go beyond that because it's just intrinsic to a thoughtful and empathetic solution that there'd be more behind it than you can easily imagine in advance. So I believe in that. I think that would be great.
Yeah, well said.
All right. Well, that I think is a good way to wrap up the discussion. It leads back to the questions that are posed by the artwork in the exhibition. And I think that one of the interesting things to think about is how we didn't maybe talk about this quite as much, is how mental and emotional health are also very strongly impacted by architecture, not just sort of high design architecture, but also vernacular architecture and kind of lower budget forms. And, you know, that goes into all kinds of human production and creativity. The piece that you can see behind Jon is a large photogram by an artist called, Martina, I'm gonna mispronounce your last name. So I'm actually just going to spell it. Martina is an amazing, amazing artist who makes these lovely photograms. This particular piece is made from a bunch of sensitized paper that was laid down on the sidewalk, and the light of a street lamp was able to shine through the leaves and branches of a tree and make a print just on the surface of the paper using the light from that phenomenon. And I think it's a really sort of, you know, a very pertinent way to think about how space impacts us, how light has you know, a psychic influence as well as a physical influence on our bodies and our minds. So thank you, Jon. That was amazing. What a wonderful, wonderful talk. Is there anything else that you'd like to say before we end?
No, just thanks for everybody to spend their time this evening on this topic. It's been a great pleasure for me. I really appreciate the chance to chat. And especially, Susan, it's been lovely to have this chance to talk again. I hope that the conversation continues.
Yeah, thanks, Jon.
It's a great conversation, Susan. I'm so happy that you were here. I have put into the chat box a link to the website of Martina. I'm not even going to say your name. I'm so sorry. The fantastic artist of the photograms, which inhabit the space and activate it so beautifully while talking about light. I've also put a link to the next UNE Art Gallery event, which will be taking place on April 7th. This event will be held live in our Biddeford Gallery and also broadcast, I believe, via Facebook Live on the main university Facebook site. The title of the event is Place and Narrative in the North Atlantic with Holly Parker and artists from the Bright Horizons exhibit, which is a collaborative exhibition between the UNE Art Galleries and UNE North, which is up through June 3rd. So I hope you can make it to that. And thank you so much to all of our audience members for being here tonight.
Thank you, Hillary.
Thank you very
Thanks,
much, Jon.
Hillary and John. Thank you so much.
Take care. You too.
Yeah. And Lee and Dave in the background. Thank you.